Welcome to Trauma Bay. Where did our gods come from? Why did humans across continents and time periods come up with such similar ideas? Invisible beings watching over us, judging us, sometimes helping, sometimes punishing. And maybe more importantly, why did it stick? Why did the belief in unseen powers become a defining feature of human culture, from primitive tribal chants to elaborate modern theologies? It's easy to assume religion was just taught to us, passed down like language or cuisine. But that skips the deeper question. Why was it invented in the first place? What evolutionary purpose, if any, did belief in God serve for early humans? Because no matter how we personally feel about religion today, the fact that it's persisted across tens of thousands of years suggests it tapped into something powerful, something deeply rooted in the human mind. Let's start at the beginning, before temples, before scriptures, before the idea of a single almighty God. Back when our ancestors were still roaming the savannah, dodging predators and trying not to starve. Back then, survival wasn't guaranteed. Life was short, brutal, and full of uncertainty. And uncertainty, from an evolutionary standpoint, is dangerous. The human brain adapted not for truth, but for survival. And survival favors quick assumptions, fast pattern recognition, and cautious overreaction. If you hear a rustle in the bushes, it's better to assume it's a lion and be wrong than assume it's the wind and get eaten. This is the origin of what psychologists call hyperactive agency detection, the tendency to assume that events in our environment are caused by something or someone. It's the same instinct that makes kids think their toys come alive when no one's looking, or that the wind is angry during a storm. In evolutionary terms, this cognitive bias makes sense. Better safe than sorry. Better to believe something is watching than to be caught off guard. But once this pattern of thinking becomes part of our mental wiring, it opens the door to more complex beliefs. Not just that something is watching, but that it has intentions, that it rewards or punishes, that it can be pleased or angered. Now add language into the mix. Once we could describe and share these imagined agents with others, they became communal stories. And stories have power, not just power to entertain, but power to organize behavior, bond groups, and transmit values across generations. The earliest gods weren't all-powerful creators. They were spirits of rivers, trees, animals, sometimes ancestors or weather forces. These were the things early humans depended on, feared, or couldn't explain. When lightning struck or a drought ruined crops, it made emotional sense to think it happened because someone or something was upset. That emotional logic is key. Evolution didn't give us brains that seek objective truth. It gave us brains that crave meaning, and gods provided meaning in an otherwise brutal and chaotic world. They explained the unexplainable. They offered comfort for grief. They gave a sense of control. If you do the right ritual or pray the right way, maybe the storm will pass. And crucially, they helped bind the tribe together. Shared belief in a higher power meant shared rules, shared rituals, and shared punishments for breaking them. In a small group, where social cohesion was the difference between survival and death, this was incredibly useful. So, in a way, belief in gods acted like social glue, a psychological hack that stabilized groups and encouraged cooperation. You might not want to share food with a stranger, but if that stranger believes in the same spirit who punishes greed, suddenly you have a reason to trust them. Over time, as tribes grew and became settlements, and settlements turned into early civilizations, these beliefs scaled up. Tribal gods became city gods, then pantheons of gods, and eventually, for some cultures, a single god that ruled over all. This shift wasn't random. A powerful centralized deity mirrors a powerful centralized government. One king above all. One God above all. As human society became more complex, so did religion. But the basic psychological machinery, pattern detection, agency attribution, social bonding, stayed the same. That's why religions across the world, despite all their differences, tend to share certain features. A moral code backed by divine authority, rituals that signal group membership, stories of punishment and reward, and often some version of the afterlife. These weren't just spiritual ideas, they were social technologies. They shaped behavior in ways that benefited the group, enforced norms even when no one was watching, and made people internalize guilt and shame long before law enforcement ever existed. And all of it was built on that basic evolutionary foundation, the need to understand our world, to find patterns, to assign agency, and to feel like we matter. Even today, those instincts haven't disappeared. We're still pattern seekers, still story makers, still emotionally driven to find meaning in suffering. The difference is, we now have tools that let us step back, observe those instincts, and ask whether they still serve us. Whether the beliefs that once helped our ancestors survive are still helping us thrive, or whether we're now trapped in mental habits that no longer fit the world we live in. It's not that belief itself is irrational, it's that it came from a time when rationality wasn't the priority. When you're cold, starving, or surrounded by predators, believing in a spirit who might protect your tribe isn't foolish, it's functional. And the more you believe it, the more you act in ways that reinforce that belief. You follow the rituals, you obey the taboos, you trust your group, you teach your children to do the same. Over generations, this becomes culture. But culture isn't hardwired. It's passed down like a script. And once the story gets strong enough, people stop seeing it as a story. It becomes reality. This is one of the most fascinating and disturbing things about belief in gods. It starts as metaphor and ends up as metaphysics. At some point, the rain god is no longer a symbol for nature's chaos. He becomes an actual being who controls it, and questioning that belief stops being curiosity and starts being heresy. This shift from functional story to unquestionable truth happens quietly and often unconsciously. But it's critical to understanding why religion became so deeply entrenched, because the gods weren't just explanations. They were authorities, and in a world without science, that authority was absolute. If crops failed, if children died, if war broke out, there had to be a reason. And the reason was usually moral. The gods were angry. Someone had sinned. The tribe needed to atone. This belief in divine punishment wasn't just superstition. It created real behavioral incentives. If you thought your actions could bring disaster on your entire community, you'd think twice before breaking the rules. But it also created a dangerous precedent. Now, those in power could claim to speak for the gods. They could define what counted as sin, who was guilty, and how they should be punished. And because the gods couldn't be questioned, neither could the people who represented them. So, what began as a shared psychological strategy for survival eventually became a tool for control. Not because belief in itself is evil, but because it can be shaped, manipulated, and weaponized, especially when people stop remembering where it came from. We tend to think of belief in gods as a question of faith, but maybe it's more accurate to see it as a legacy of evolution, a byproduct of how our brains are wired to survive in an uncertain world. And that makes it even more compelling, because it means belief doesn't necessarily come from divine revelation, but from mental patterns that evolved long before we had any concept of gods at all. Cognitive scientists have found that even young children, without formal religious instruction, naturally attribute purpose to things in nature. Ask a 4-year-old why mountains exist, and they're likely to say something like, "So animals have a place to live." It's called teleological thinking, the tendency to assume things exist for a reason. It's incredibly common in children, and unless it's questioned or redirected, it carries into adulthood. This makes the human mind fertile ground for religious ideas, because belief in gods offers answers that satisfy these intuitions. It explains why things happen, who's behind it, and what you're supposed to do about it. Now, add emotional vulnerability into the mix: fear of death, longing for justice, grief after loss. And religion offers something even more powerful: comfort. That comfort is real, even if the belief isn't. And this is why gods endure, not just because people are ignorant or brainwashed or afraid to think, though sometimes those things play a role. They endure because the belief system aligns with deep, ancient structures in our minds. It answers our questions, calms our fears, and connects us to others. But that doesn't make it true. In fact, the fact that it's so psychologically appealing should make us more skeptical, not less. Because when something fits too perfectly with what we want to believe, that's when we should be most cautious. The evolutionary story of gods is not about debunking religion with mockery. It's about understanding why we're drawn to it in the first place. Not as a failure of reason, but as a feature of the human condition. We are meaning makers, pattern finders, storytellers, and for most of our history, the God story was the most powerful one we had. It united tribes, organized civilizations, explained suffering, and gave people a framework for morality long before law and science caught up. But now that we understand where those stories came from, the question is, do we still need them? Are we holding on to them out of habit, fear, or nostalgia, or because they're actually helping us live better lives today? Because evolution doesn't care about truth. It only cares about survival. And what helped us survive in the past might be holding us back in the present. That's the uncomfortable reality most people avoid when talking about belief. We didn't evolve to believe in what's true. We evolved to believe in what keeps us alive. And sometimes, those two things overlap. But not always. Believing in invisible beings who watch our actions may have once made us more cooperative, more cautious, more loyal to our group. But in the modern world, those same instincts can backfire. They can divide people, justify violence, encourage magical thinking, and make it harder to solve real problems with real solutions. If you think natural disasters are caused by moral failure, you don't invest in climate science. If you think illness is punishment from the gods, you don't develop medicine. If you believe your sacred book has all the answers, you're less likely to question, doubt, or discover. And that's the real cost of inherited belief. Not just that it's false, but that it replaces curiosity with certainty. Once we decide a God is responsible for something, we stop looking for other explanations. And that mindset doesn't just stall progress. It shapes the way we think at a fundamental level. It teaches us to accept without evidence, to obey without question, to see complexity and reduce it to divine will. But the universe doesn't bend to our stories. It doesn't punish us with floods or reward us with sunshine. It just is. And while that might feel cold or lonely at first, it's also what makes reality beautiful, because it's not handed to us. We have to uncover it. Every scientific breakthrough, every moral improvement, every expansion of human rights, these didn't come from revelation. They came from asking hard questions. They came from pushing against tradition, not surrendering to it. And the irony is, many of those breakthroughs were resisted by the very belief systems that once helped us form societies in the first place. The same institutions that built temples and preserved ancient texts often tried to silence heretics, ban new ideas, and punish dissent. Because once belief becomes institutionalized, it stops evolving. It clings to authority. It fears change. It confuses obedience with virtue, but human beings evolve, ideas evolve, morality evolves, and belief, if it can't adapt to new knowledge, becomes a kind of fossilized psychology, still powerful, still influential, but rooted in a version of the world that no longer exists. Today, we live in cities, not tribes. Our threats are complex and systemic, not just predators in the bushes, and our tools for understanding reality have advanced light years beyond superstition. But we still carry the mental software of our ancestors. We still feel like someone's watching when no one is. We still search for meaning in random events. We still long for justice beyond the grave. And none of that makes us weak. It makes us human. But it also means we need to be honest with ourselves. Honest about where our beliefs come from, what they're doing for us, and whether they still serve the kind of world we want to build. Because belief in gods wasn't a revelation from above. It was a reflection of what we needed. We needed explanations, community, control over chaos, and gods gave us all of that in a package our brains could understand. But now we have better tools. We have science to explain the unknown, secular ethics to guide behavior, global communication to connect us. We don't need to invoke spirits to explain the weather, or invent invisible judges to keep us moral. We can take responsibility for our own behavior, our own societies, our own future. And in many ways, that's more meaningful than anything religion ever offered, because it doesn't depend on someone else watching, or judging, or rewarding you after you die. It depends on you, and the choices you make while you're alive. That's not a comforting illusion. It's a difficult truth, but it's also empowering, because when you stop outsourcing responsibility to the heavens, you realize it was in your hands all along. And maybe that's the next step in human evolution, not just physical or technological, but psychological, growing out of the need for imagined fathers in the sky and stepping into a world where meaning isn't given. It's made by us, by how we treat each other, how we use knowledge, how we handle uncertainty without retreating into mythology. Belief in gods may have helped us survive, but outgrowing that belief might help us thrive, not by rejecting everything that came before, but by understanding where it came from and choosing, consciously, to build something better. That's how evolution works. Not by clinging to the past, but by adapting to the present and preparing for the future. So maybe the real question isn't, why do people believe in gods? Maybe it's, now that we know why we did, what comes next?